Coulong, your host of This Week in Cloud Computing. We are at episode 3, and I am very excited to announce that with the first 2 shows, we've already sold out our sponsorships.
We did.
For right now.
It's really exciting. It's really amazing.
Yeah.
We're actually welcoming our second sponsor. They actually grabbed 2 slots. So, and you'll learn more about them in a little bit. But,
yes.
And also
we don't want to give them away just yet.
Yes, but also Verticore, still with us, obviously, and still doing great things.
At Verticore on Twitter.
They were our first sponsor, so we want to show the love both ways.
Exactly. So, in addition to the sponsors, obviously, we have some special guests this week. In studio today with us, we have Damon Young over here to my left, who is the VP of Sales at Morph Labs.
Thank
How
you.
are you?
I'm great. Thank you guys for having me. Good to see old friends.
Yeah.
Our pleasure.
Dave Fernite on Twitter.
That would be me.
And then joining us virtually through Skype, we also have Sam Ramji, who is the VP of Strategy at Sonoa Systems. How are you, Sam? Can you hear us?
I'm doing great. The sound is good.
Great to see you. Thanks for joining us here today. And then let's just jump right into some stuff. We've got the RSA Security Conference has been going on this week, and so there's a lot of discussion around security in the cloud. Now, we'll be careful not to get too far into that because we do have a special show next week specifically around security, right, Mark?
Yes, we do.
But there are some topics that we will be going over today that's really dealing more with is the cloud insecure.
Yes, indeed.
So, do we want to maybe hit on some of that right now to start?
I have my own opinions about that.
Well, go
Please,
ahead,
Damon,
Damon.
don't hold back. Tell us what you
Not
I
hold
look
back,
at
Damon.
I look at it this way. Anybody who talks about how insecure the cloud is, my first question to them is, have you ever bought anything off of Amazon? Because if you have, what are we talking about?
Right.
I mean,
But what are you talking about? I mean, you mean books? Like bought books off Amazon or EC2?
Have you used your credit card to buy something on Amazon? Because
Sure.
that means that Amazon
Everybody
has exactly. So everyone at some level or a large portion of the community is already entrusting the cloud with their private data to begin with. Whether they even
Why
realize
is that?
it or
Because
not.
Amazon's on the cloud
Of course.
themselves?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Amazon, PayPal, eBay, all those places. So I think I was at the Cloud Computing Expo this past November, and one of the panelists, he said that most conversations, at least within most business and corporate conversations around security and the cloud, are far more political than technical. And that a lot of the technical issues, either they have been addressed by the major by the major kind of current public cloud vendors,
Right.
or the technology exists so that if you were to go to that place, you can make that change. And then on the other side, if you're talking about private cloud, then at that point the question is, well, the question isn't about the cloud, it's about what's your current infrastructure. Because ultimately, private
Right.
cloud is happening inside of your data center. So it's not a matter of how secure this private cloud deployment is, it's how secure is your data center, how secure is your infrastructure. And presumably all these things were built before anyone even conceived of the term cloud computing, and were built largely from
Well,
the
we were
sense of
talking about that
security,
last
things like
week.
that.
Everyone's cloud washing their data centers. They're basically throwing
Cloud
the word
washing?
cloud.
Is that the word?
That was the term.
That's what
That
we're
was the
using.
term, yeah,
Mark
actually, I gotta
loves
give
to
that-
come up with terms of his
I
own.
love
But
that.
this one's
Cloud
not mine. I have to
washing.
give credit where credit is due. It's not mine. But yeah, it's.
If I can offer a perspective, one of the things that's happening is that the word cloud is so big and it sort of has become a conflated word that means a whole bunch of different new technologies. There's a natural interest in declaring it to be insecure, whether that's politically to slow down adoption inside a company because somebody doesn't know exactly how to implement it. They say there's a security issue here. I remember a few years ago when everybody was doing this with open source. Oh, you can't use open source because it's not secure. Really, once you get down into anything, a cloud vendor can be as secure as anything else, and it really depends on what use you're putting the cloud to. But I love the point that was made just before, which is the cloud basically runs on top of HTTP. If you're using a cloud service, you're probably using REST, and HTTP's got all sorts of basic common standards like two-way SSL and mechanisms you use to buy goods every single day.
I mean, it always amazes me, the people who are so kind of freaked out about going on the web. I'm like, you know what, people were buying things with credit cards over the phone for years. You have no idea who the other human being is on the other end of that phone that could easily just walk away with that card and do so.
Right.
I don't know why the presumption is, in many ways, I feel like the technology has made the world more secure than it had been in the past. So
People were buying products over the web from sock puppets, let's be clear, right?
That's a good point.
It's a
although
Turing, it's a
I'd rather
Turing
be
problem at some point,
reminded
yeah.
of the late 90s, but that's okay.
So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that are coming out of this. there are lots of announcements too. I mean, we've got a joint announcement, with RSA, VMware, and Intel. They unveiled a proof of concept for a control framework that's designed to expand security in a cloud-centric world, as they say. But it's this whole notion of establishing a secure root of trust by using Intel, their trusted execution technology. Controls are applied at the lowest levels of the platform, from boot time, and I mean, there are a lot of things here
a lot of stuff came out of that
that are
conference.
coming out of the conference.
Yeah, we're gonna dissect a little bit of that stuff in the news.
I
think.
know.
So,
Okay, I won't talk about it
That's
now.
okay. I don't like shush you. I'm just, we got some stuff coming up later, and this is a little teaser.
Yeah. So that's security. So let's get off security for about a second here, because what I would love to do is, Damon, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about Morph Labs and specifically what you guys are focusing on right now.
So, Morph Labs is a company that spun out of this private incubator, G2iCC, Global Gateway Innovation Exchange.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Yeah. Can you say it one more time?
Global Gateway Innovation Exchange.
Okay. So
or G2iCC.
G2iCC.
Right.
TWiCC.
And G2iCC is an incubator kind of founded in the model of Intel Capital, where we start various technologies in-house with our team of engineers that they then create companies around and then spawn off. So we've done a couple of those since the company's founding. The first one was Glucode that we sold off to IBM back in 2005, and then we've had a couple more since then. So Morph is, I believe, company number 5 out of the ones we've spun off. And Morph was initially a application deployment framework on the public cloud, where
what does that mean exactly?
So in other words, if I'm a programmer and I've got this idea for a new web app, I write some code. And yes, it's great and it's wonderful. I've developed it in-house. But then to actually make it an application that's available on the web, I have to put a framework around it in terms of web servers that balance the traffic, database servers, application servers that scales things like that.
Your typical architecture that you would normally do
Exactly.
if you were doing your own data center implementation.
Exactly. And so the average, as our CTO always says, no one actually wants to run servers.
No,
no one really wants to run servers at all.
I really would rather escape the entire thing entirely if I could.
And so the original idea from Morph was, if you had a piece of code that you wanted to make available, you can literally just come to us with the code and drop it in, and it'll run it, and it'll put a framework around it that you can make it available and publish it out into the web.
So magically, I don't have to use the architecture that I now have to design myself.
Exactly. I mean, and you can define what that architecture would be. I mean, this is what our original implementation of Morph was, and it was it's a public cloud, more of a a PaaS or SaaS version of that. We had support for Java, Rails, and PHP apps.
Okay.
And we did that back in 2008, and we've got maybe 4,000 application deployments on there since then.
Are any of them really large, or they tend to be a lot of sort of small balls?
I would say they're mostly kind of SMBs and things like that. I mean,
What's an SMB?
Small and medium-sized.
We are about defining
I'm
every
a
single
sales guy, so I got all the.
It's an MTV with an HBO
right, exactly.
with an ESPN. So I'm gonna
It's
slow
like
you
a
down
scene
a
out
little
of Dr.
bit.
Strangelove where they just drop everything.
I just want to make sure everyone understands where we're all at, including me.
So that was
We're
what
about
our
defining these
kind
things.
of
There you
our
go.
original. But that was really, in a lot of ways, kind of a proof of concept for what our real idea was to take, because all that was available on EC2.
Right.
But we've taken that entire stack from the application all the way down to the infrastructure and formed a product around it.
Okay.
That is now, we can now replicate that entire stack in a fashion in a private deployment. So essentially getting all of the elasticities you would get at EC2, but also the application infrastructure support and high availability support that we built on top of that and can do it inside of a private deployment. So for instance, if you were an enterprise, now you can do elastic application deployment, but also have a standardized deployment framework. So a huge chunk of software development, maybe 20% of it is the actual business logic, and the remaining 80% is figuring out what framework you're going to deployment on.
Right.
But now that you've got this repeatable framework that we can support, now you can cut down on your deployment, cut down on your development time, and also cut down on the bugs that come from going across systems. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we can do is now, we have pre-built support for Java, Rails, and PHP because we're making that available publicly.
Right.
But we can...
What about Python?
We can support Python. Essentially, we can support any development framework that you want, rather than, and this is, I think, the big advantage over a lot of the other PaaS vendors out there who make you rewrite your app to match what their framework is.
Yeah,
we'll essentially go to you and say, well, tell us what your framework is, and we'll build a template that supports it and make it elastic.
I see. Okay. Interesting.
So we're talking a lot with enterprises to help them with their application deployment and management, and also to managed service providers and large-scale wholesale data centers, because our sense is you can use our technology and essentially get into the same game that EC2 is at, being able to make on-demand applications, clouds, and servers available on an on-demand utility basis. and be able to do what EC2 can't, which is essentially provide any form of reasonable customer support. I mean, EC2 is great from a technology perspective, but if something breaks, there's no guy at Amazon you can ring his
there
neck.
is. You have to pay for it though.
Well, there it is.
EC2, so.
And we think that there's a very untapped market for the managed service providers
There does seem
who
to be a
already have the infrastructure, but their servers are dramatically underutilized, and you can take those resources, which is essentially what Amazon did. I mean, Amazon had all these servers that really only spiked during Christmas time, and they thought, well, how can we get value out of it? So our play is to look at those vendors and say, hey, we can help you get into that game and fight the kind of existential threat that you're facing from the likes of EC2 and Rackspace and places like that.
Let me stop you there because I want to hear from our other guests.
Oh, I know. I could talk all
That's
day.
okay. We love you.
This is my job.
That's why we brought you on the show. We love it. But
This is good though
He's
because
good at it. Roll with it.
well, this is great when we can continue this because one thing I want to jump into with Sam, what's interesting here is on Damon's side, we've got a vendor that is focusing on open standards, right?
This is true. I mean, and all of the components that make up our stack ultimately come from an open standard because our sense is vendor standards are very dangerous. And vendors go away, vendors get changed, whatever. And there's very clearly established open standards in the market, particularly the Amazon cloud. And we want to make sure, even though we have secret sauce we put in it to kind of pull these things together, but if, heaven forbid, we were to go away, anyone who deploys on our platform can take it somewhere else. So I think portability and compatibility for the hybrid cloud are the key elements that we want to focus on.
Okay. Now, the reason I wanted Damon to say that is because, Sam, I believe you have some interesting thoughts also as it relates to open standards. Am I right?
Well, it'll be up to you and your visitors to figure out if they're interesting. But yeah, I'm a huge believer in open standards. I'm a great believer in Tim O'Reilly's small pieces, loosely joined, and many of them as being the way that you create a big, resilient environment for everybody to be able to build new applications and to benefit from everybody else's ideas. So exactly the point that was just made is when standards are prevalent, everybody can come and implement to the standards. You can provide secret sauce. You can provide value add that could provide acceleration or better security or analytics or caching or who knows what. But you can do so transparently, and as long as control is in the right place, you don't end up with monopoly situations where a single vendor is able to pull the rug by changing the implementation and then forcing a lot of people to move or having other kinds of bad results in the economy. In open standards right now, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I think it's an interesting topic would be what do we do with de facto standards that are merging. So Morph is dealing with like Heroku or like Engine Yard with EC2 with Amazon's AWS APIs. EC2 has its own management APIs. They've now rolled out load balancing services or LBS, relational data services RDS. They've got S3. These are all pretty standard APIs that are become standards. And now you've got open source programs like Eucalyptus implementing EC2, and maybe that's enabling some people to build on-premise versions of Amazon's clouds. But there's no standards body. There's not even a community of people outside Amazon working on those APIs. Does that give one vendor too much control? And as you get open source implementations that match that interface, does that start to cement those interfaces in place as being bigger than de facto standards, almost looking like standards that have been built by a committee? Not that committees are the be-all, end-all, but it just goes back to that idea of control. And we know from pretty much every market that's existed that monopolies are always dangerous.
Absolutely.
Okay, now I guess I got to stop you there because I'm hearing something, but I'm not sure what it is.
What are you hearing, Mark?
I don't know. There's something I'm hearing, and I just
Yeah, we are hearing something.
It's not quite coming through yet.
Oh, what is that?
It's not quite coming through yet. All right, I guess we're going to have to go without it. I had this whole thing planned out. It's just not working. So our new sponsor is Storm. I hear something. What could that be?
What was that?
Okay, so this is our new sponsor, Storm On Demand, or Storm On Demand, as I like to say. We all have our cups with the Storm On Demand. All right, we can lose the Valkyries. All right, so Storm On Demand at stormondemand.com is a infrastructure as a service cloud computing platform that is powerful enough to replace dedicated servers. Storm On Demand is a proprietary cloud platform that was designed by Liquid Web, who's one of the largest web hosting providers, with over 12 years of experience. Storm On Demand is easier to use and less expensive than Amazon EC2. Features include server setup in minutes, easy scaling, backup and restoration capabilities, pay-as-you-go utility-style billing. Options include cPanel, Fantastico, Ubuntu, Debian, CentOS, fully managed servers, private networking, and much, much more. Storm on Demand, stormondemand.com. So, in English, and there's basically a couple, obviously a bunch of products that they offer. But when you set up a server normally at some place, a managed service provider, right? They actually set up a physical server for you. So they go into the rack, they install it, they install the operating system. This is the same thing, but it's virtualized. So you get a virtual server that exists in their cloud that they've built, and they basically built their own proprietary software to coordinate all the machines and share the resources. And you can basically, within a few minutes, set up the equivalent of your own private server, just as powerful, just as everything. So really nice system. Really love Storm. They came on. They came on this week, end of last week, and they basically bought the last 2 slots. So we're fully sold out. So thank you once again, Storm on Demand.
Excellent.
And if you were to run Morph on top of Storm, you'd have everything you needed, right?
There you go.
See,
You're
these
thinking.
are
Hey, I call this guy.
I guess I'll just make one last point, which kind of relates to
it makes an interesting point. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of what I like about to pat your sponsors on the back a bit is that they very clearly delineated these are the layers where we play. These are the services that we provide in this space, and this is where we exist on either side of the firewall.
Right.
I think that cloud is the hot new thing, and I think, as Amanda's heard me say many times, there's a lot of deliberate obfuscation out there. When people come and say, we're a cloud company, and that's essentially meaningless. I mean,
and that's quite a theme that
cloud
we've
watching.
had on the show so far, just with these first few episodes, is and to your point, Sam, also, everyone is saying, we're cloud. Well, to that point, one thing I like to do with the show is get each person to define cloud computing in their own words. So I'm throwing the ball over to you, Sam. I want to know what cloud computing is to you.
Sure. Well, the timing's great. I've just had the opportunity to to become a contributing editor to the ACM's journal Ubiquity. My first article for the launch this month is Cloud Computing is More Than Hype, so I'm offering a few definitions in it. I guess as a little bit of background, I'd say there isn't room for another word in the pantheon, right? There's desktop computing, there's mobile computing, there's mainframe computing, and all the others. I also think in 10 years, it'll just be called computing, and the substance will be taken for granted, right? But I think it builds on top of ideas like grid and utility computing. Certainly, it has its roots in ASPs and technical roots in virtualization. But I think of it being basically breaking down into infrastructure and services, right? So infrastructure is where you've got the actual hardware and software required to implement and operate a service. So VMware provides cloud computing infrastructure if you're going to operate it over the internet and not have to worry about managing it. Services would be things like Salesforce.com, Google Docs, Morph if you're running it on EC2, Sonoa's technology, Apogee.com, which runs on EC2, Google Maps, those types of things would be services. And the third component of cloud computing, I think, that most people don't discuss is the people who are operating the infrastructure to provide the service. So in general, all of this means that you can get the capability you want, you can get it without installing your own software, you can get it transparently delivered over the internet without worrying about how it runs or how it scales. That's kind of my nutshell definition, is that last sentence there.
I like that a lot. And Damon, what would you say cloud computing is?
Yeah, so I'm lazy, right? I mean, I always go back to, there's an outstanding document that's put out by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I believe, that has what I think is the best and kind of most comprehensive definition of cloud computing. And they talk about essentially that there are essential functional elements that go into cloud computing in terms of being able to get access to computing resources in an on-demand fashion, being able to have those resources scale and have elasticity to be available for those resources. Those are the two kind of essential components, I think, that go into cloud computing. I think when people talk about the cloud, they're usually talking about the public cloud,
right,
meaning they're pulling resources off of the web through some kind of amorphous black box that they don't know anything about. I think, for what we do in terms of helping to build a replica of the cloud of what you would see on the public cloud in a private fashion, so behind the firewall, either for an enterprise or in a managed service provider or something like that. But being able to get those same kind of capacity to have these things available on a on-demand basis, to have the elasticity, to have the instant availability, those are at least in my opinion, what the essential elements of cloud computing are. Now there's different layers of, or how different ways that gets delivered. I mean, we're talking about either raw computing power, which is infrastructure as a service, the capacity to create applications, which is platform as a service, or just functional applications themselves, which is software as a service, which I think is what most people are familiar with these days. But those are really the kind of the box around it. I've never come up with kind of like a single sentence.
But once again,
cloud computing.
Once again, it's an inkblot word. Everyone has their own little spin.
Exactly.
Well, sure. I mean, I think that's where the danger comes in, right? Because there's a lot of companies that are very, very old, not really cloud computing companies that have tried to put on cloud computing hats, trying to ride the wave. And there are other places that are trying to avoid extinction by grabbing onto the cloud computing label. So I think one of the things that we've done is that we do internally when we talk to people is we have a document that's called Questions to Ask Your Cloud Provider, and to say these are the things that if you're looking at deploying a cloud, you want to be able to see, well, these are the features that we think you probably want to say are essential features or capacities within that. Do your users have capacity to self-provision? Can they provision on demand? I think there's some people who say that they're a cloud vendor, which is essentially just kind of a dedicated server that they can now get access to. That's not really a cloud vendor anymore. I mean, if you can get, that's...
I don't know. I think that's what, in my mind, I mean, I said this in the last show. I don't want to repeat content from last shows, but in my mind, just very simply, it's getting rid of the pain of managing my own hardware. If you take that pain away from me and I just don't have to worry about that anymore and I can just focus on my applications, that's fine. And I consider that to be the
and to your point, I would say it also, now we're expanding to a point where we're saying getting rid of the pain of having to run your applications, manage your applications, manage platforms. So
and give me the transparency, give the security, and make it cost less.
Yes.
If you can actually really do those things, then you got me. Sorry, you had a
I would say that Damon's point is exactly on the right track. What you just described was the lowest common denominator for what you could acceptably be called cloud computing. Maybe you could say, every man's EDS. Right, you're a mess for less in the cloud.
I like that definition.
If you really want to step into today, or not even to the future, right? You're looking at the modern generation of an application server. You've got an application fabric like Morph or Google App Engine or Heroku or Microsoft Azure, taking away a lot of the cruft and levels below. Like, how do I think about storage? Where did that go? Did I have to deal with that as a developer, or did it just become much easier for me to write my apps? And then even a level above, people like Mark Benioff have spent tons of time saying that the higher level app services, when you don't have to install the software, we'll call that cloud computing. So it becomes more meaningful, I think, to everyday users, right? To our parents or spouses, right? All of our non-technical friends who still have to use computing. When you say, look, when you don't have to install or upgrade or version the software and it just kind of is always working whenever you want it to, that's where cloud computing starts to matter to you.
Right. Well, I think we have a special segment that we need to go into.
I think it's time to do the
because
segment.
Mark will have a tantrum if we do not have the Mark Laughlin. I can never say it.
Mark Laughlin.
Mark Laughlin.
From Santa Monica, Mark Laughlin
Group, the American original.
Yes, we have better special effects than Avatar. All right. Issue number 1. Respect my security. A recent survey showed that 51% of corporations said that security was the main concern about cloud computing. Our industry needs to deliver security solutions that ensure levels of security that surpass what's available today, said Arthur Ciavello, Executive Vice President of EMC Corp. People need to trust the cloud. And, hand in hand with this, announced on March 2nd, a new standards body, including Novell, Microsoft, Dell, Rackspace, Qualys, HP, Intel, Cisco, McAfee, and Salesforce, and Symantec, all announced the Cloud Security Alliance to tackle cloud standards. The question, will these standard efforts really do any good in making the cloud secure, or will they merely help with perception? I ask you, Damon.
Well, perception's everything. I mean, ultimately, if people don't believe the security exists, the security doesn't exist. So
51% says it's their main concern.
I
So in
mean,
their heads.
Exactly. I mean, like I said, the technology has either already been implemented or already exists and simply needs to be assembled. They can provide the level of security that people need, but people don't believe it. But it's because it's new. I mean, think about it. 15 years ago, you wouldn't even dream of sending a contract through email, right? People would think that I mean, legal documents and things like that. Email was, it was the exact same question that people raised about email before that. Before that, it was fax machines that people raised the same issues around. So it's really a matter of, I mean, there's a level of education that has to happen so people understand what actually is happening and where they're being protected. And then there's a level of protection. And clearly there's certain entrenched interests that are interested in being able to keep all these things in-house because there's a sense that, well, as long as I can kind of hug the server, then clearly it won't break. But then there's also the notion of that once you take it outside of their physical location, that when the server goes away, then my job goes away. And I think that's a real fear that has to be addressed inside the IT organizations in various companies to say, no, the cloud doesn't take away your job. The cloud actually brings back the job you originally signed up for. The cloud means you no longer had to do all of the stuff that you were I wouldn't say wasting your time with, but things that were not part of your original job description.
Well, what they're proposing here is basically, good housekeeping seal of approval, right, on your cloud, saying, yes, this is secure, this is not going to, nobody's going to invade this. It's really the security issue. It's not the performance, it's not the cost, it's security.
Well, let's jump in over here. I want to make sure that we're also getting Sam into this. Sam, do you think it's important to have a standards body?
Yeah, I think probably more for perception than for reality in terms of a standards body. We know standards bodies don't move particularly quickly, especially when they've got a lot of vendors on them. They tend to be about as apolitical as the U.S. Senate, right? Everybody's trying to push some kind of perspective in there, right? Having been at Microsoft for about 5 years and at BEA Systems for 3 years before that, I've seen a lot of standards body activity from the inside out. But on the other hand, I was at the airport just a few weeks ago, and I saw, a mom with a young baby and a small, in a baby carrier, and getting the baby out as she went through security. Put the carrier through the X-ray machine, right? Of course, she looks like a terribly deadly person, about a 5'2" blonde woman. Not
kind of like Amanda.
We are deadly, Sam. We're very
right. So
you don't want to underestimate this one, trust me.
Right, but I'm just saying, why did that happen? Well, it happened because people need to perceive that something's happening, so they feel secure. There's guards and X-ray scanners, and something must be happening. So even if that body never meets more than once a year, as long as they put out plenty of press releases, your everyday person's going to feel better about the cloud. And that's probably good for all of us, because as we started the session talking with Damon and I both pointing out, hey, there's SSL. If you've done a credit card transaction, the cloud can be secure. On the flip side, I think just having those vendors stand up and say, we're going to make it secure helps too, because security in practice is always an issue of integration. The weakest link is always the problem in security. It's not the strongest link. So where somebody doesn't understand how to integrate their firewall into this and make sure a particular rule is followed, or that they've got some issue with how their semantic infrastructure is working and handing off to their Microsoft infrastructure, that's all going to show up as a weakest link. Somebody breaks that, there's a terrible outcry, and somebody says, oh, I knew the cloud wasn't secure. So some of that work is going to have to get done.
Right.
So I think it's important. Will it change people's security day to day today? No. Will it have an impact in a year? No. But will it change people's perceptions immediately? Probably. And will it have long-term good effects? Probably so. In the meantime, the rest of us who are really trying to deliver cloud technologies today will probably be doing the work needed to say, what are the real problems? What are we doing with OAuth? Why does it make sense to be able to log into your bank account with Twitter or not, and help make all this stuff work?
You make a great point when you talk about, because I think it was maybe a month or so ago, there were a bunch of very high-profile, quote-unquote, cloud failures. The names of the companies escape me right now, but
Google.
I'm not
Google had a security failure.
Was it that one?
Whether it was a cloud security failure.
There were a couple of other vendors like at the beginning of the year, and everyone's like, "Oh, that means that the cloud is not secure." And one of the things that our CTO always says, so many people are so big on bragging about nines. We got 5 nines or 6 nines or 7 nines.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And my point is, it doesn't matter how many nines you have, because that 0.00001% will always happen.
Right.
And what our lead engineering guy always says is, you have to assume failure. You have to assume that failure will always happen. And so the trick isn't about trying to avoid failure. It's about what is your policy in the event that failure happens? Do you
Right.
have redundancies? Do you have recovery plans?
Right.
And I think, in some instances, particularly in these early cloud, quote-unquote cloud failures, there were some very large vendors who didn't respond quickly enough, and that's why they became the bigger issues. And there are others that were equally as large that were able to
So a
react in a way that
perception issue again, which is why we have this trusted cloud initiative.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
So
Right,
when
I-
a small vendor fails, right, nobody worries about it. But when when a name brand vendor has a failure, right, I think both Microsoft and Google had big failures this year.
I think it was
That's when
Microsoft
people
was the
start to lose trust, right? That was the danger hip top storage device, right, or storage backup service that had that failure. So it's definitely important that the big vendors get in there and start to say, yeah, this is really going to work.
Yeah, I guess they were just saying it was T-Mobile.
T-Mobile, I
So,
think.
yeah,
I
I
think
think
it was-
that's
yeah,
correct.
yeah.
So I have a question for both you guys, because you guys keep bringing up Amazon and credit cards. I don't think that's the fear. Like I as an application provider, what I'm afraid of is if I put my application, let's say I were to take Mahalo and put it on a cloud and I know that I'm sharing computing resources with a bunch of other companies, right? My fear would be that one of those other companies might be
punch
malicious.
through the whole wall, punch through the
punch
wall.
through the wall.
Yep.
Not from the firewall, protecting me from the outside, but inside the network itself. Because we're sharing resources, by definition, we're on the same machine. There are ways to tunnel in through the operating system, through the internal. You're going to tell me there aren't, but I'm going to tell you that it is more dangerous being on shared servers with other people. There's
Yeah,
just
that's
no way you can tell me
worth worrying
not
about,
true.
right?
What's
That's
that?
worth worrying about. John Dillon of Engine Yard, I think, has a great quote on this, which is he says, a vendor cannot make your cloud infrastructure secure, but they can have practices that prevent it from being securable. There's some certifications that are crucial here, like SAS 70. A lot of the challenge in making clouds secure and useful will be in comprehension, in practices, and potentially certifications to show that you actually know and implement those practices correctly, so that you've got isolation between one customer's data and and another customer's data. That things are encrypted when they're at rest, and that the only organization with the key is the customer who owns that data. There are issues with Amazon storage service where, arguably one or more servers could, either fail, fall in the wrong hands, or be subpoenaed. How do you ensure that when data is striped across hundreds or thousands of servers, that your data is not ever going to be violated? There's got to be very clear practices around that, and people have to understand how that gets done. I would say that from our experience of what's going on with Amazon, they're doing a phenomenal job of providing really good isolation across all of their services, and they've demonstrated that. Where we get into these third-party clouds put together by vendors who are just getting into the game, who are service providers, going from being internet service providers to cloud service providers, that's where sort of the cats and dogs will show up, and we'll need to figure out who's certified to do what and who's got what best practices in place, I think.
Okay. So I think we should go to our sponsor break number 2, because we're getting a little bit long in the hour here.
Sure,
So I want
sure.
to make sure we show the love to Verticore.
Well, Verticore, of course,
Tell us
which
about
was
Verticore.
our very first ever sponsor. So, your cloud hosting provider letting you down? Take a look at managed private cloud solutions from Verticore. More secure, more reliable, more redundant than Rackspace or Amazon. A managed private cloud solution can easily replace your current IT infrastructure and eliminate IT pains. Completely avoid the cost and hassle of buying and maintaining IT equipment and software. Deliver 100% uptime to end users. Configure and deploy computing resources in just minutes. So with Verticore, your private cloud is hosted in the most advanced and secure data center on the planet, uses only best-in-class hardware and software, and gives you access to virtually unlimited bandwidth. Verticore's team of experts monitor and maintain your private cloud 24/7, 365, freeing your internal staff to concentrate on supporting only your applications and projects that can help grow your company. Verticore, make sure that you thank our sponsors, please.
Yes, please tweet out thank you to Verticore, Virtacore, and also Storm on Demand. Storm
I
on Demand.
swear he's going to be wearing a Viking hat. I don't know.
It's
That's
coming.
just
The
my
Thor
thought.
hammer is coming next week.
I don't know.
It's going to be awesome.
The hammer of Thor.
It's going to be great.
You do that really well.
Thank you. All right. Issue number 2, cloud computing or clown computing.
Oh no.
All right. TechCrunch.
You know
this
I'm
is-
afraid of clowns, right?
No, I did not know that.
Okay.
There's
Everyone
actually-
I'm
You
afraid
actually
of
have
clowns.
a fear of
I
clowns?
really don't
From
like
Poltergeist?
clowns.
Is that where you get it?
No,
There's
it's from
actually a
It.
technical, psychological.
All right,
term for
listen.
fear
This
of
is not.
clowns.
This is not this week in
There
clown
is.
computing.
Hey, you said clown computing.
I did say
so
that.
that opens
All right,
the
but I
door.
mean something else. And by cloud computing, I mean what we now call cloud wash products. All right. So this came out of TechCrunch's 10 most likely M&A deals. Number 5 on that list was Microsoft will acquire Brightcove. Now, why would they do this? So the argument that TechCrunch came up with was, or the author of TechCrunch, was that Google owns video search via its acquisition of YouTube, right? So and thereby became a leader in cloud computing. Microsoft wants to push into cloud computing, and at least conceptually, from an audience point of view, owning Brightcove legitimizes it as a cloud, or further legitimizes Microsoft as a cloud computing company. So, the question: does an MS acquisition of Brightcove legitimize it as a cloud computing powerhouse, or is this just more cloud computing? I don't ask you. I ask our other guest.
Come on, Sam.
I think it's orthogonal, actually. So I'm gonna answer the question and say it kind of doesn't apply. Microsoft's strategy there is more around search, and if you listen to Bill Gates talk about search, or Chi Lu, the president of Microsoft Online and Search Division, they'll say search is at the 10-yard line, indicating that there's 100 yards total and 90 to go. One of the things that has been talked about often is, why can't I just type in my high school and type in football and pull back somebody's home video of a video that was shot at the recent high school football game that I can't make it to because I live halfway around the world. I think YouTube is quite different. It really is cloud computing as a cloud service, and from that perspective, I mean, there's only one YouTube. Brightcove can be implemented, as much as you want, and it can expand. But YouTube is going to be the center of gravity and ends up exporting de facto standards, much like Twitter, much like Amazon. I think that's one of the other things that distinguishes the cloud computing era, is that we no longer talk about random websites. There are these really big dogs that have all of the data, and having control of that data, being able to come up with new algorithms, new searches on the data, makes you incredibly powerful. So I think it's really a different page of the Microsoft playbook here, which is about expanding strength in search as opposed to expanding strength as a cloud provider, which has more to do with their Azure strategy.
All right, so it does nothing for them in terms of being a cloud provider.
I think it's totally independent.
Yeah. Okay. So this guy's wrong.
In my opinion.
Okay. You don't want to say it, but I got it.
What do you think, Damon?
I mean, my first thought was, YouTube, in terms of the video market, makes up, like 90% of that market? And
I don't know how that breaks down, but they're clearly the monster.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that if they're looking at video to drive search, I don't know. I mean, that doesn't seem to make much sense to me as a strategy.
Okay, so you don't think they didn't do it for cloud legitimacy or search?
Yeah,
why,
I mean, it just
why
doesn't.
would they do
Why
it?
did
don't-
they
Or
do you
do
think they
it?
won't do it?
I don't think they
disagree?
would. I
Okay.
don't see what the point of that would be.
All right.
I mean, ultimately, but then I'm one of those people that didn't see the point of Bing either. I mean, I still don't see the point of Bing, because ultimately, I don't know that anyone is going to be able to really.
Bing's made a pretty big dent, I have to say.
But it's a dent. I mean, do you really?
But it's
We're
a dent
not
in
talking
Google, and
about
that's like
Bing.
that's a capital D.
Yeah, but I don't know. It's like saying that you put a dent in the Titanic. I mean, it's a huge,
Hey,
huge
there
boat.
was a big dent that
There
was
was a
put in the
dent, yeah,
Titanic.
anyway. Okay,
and it
bad
sunk.
I
analogy.
hardly think Google's
Bad analogy.
the Titanic.
Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's the wrong
All right, so
strategy.
Damon's not a fan.
Well,
I got it.
I'll just point out that determining intent from 3 words typed into a search box is super hard, and the more that every time you can add a really strong new dimension, right? If you add maps, if you add images, if you add video to that, if you add audio, then you start getting much richer context, and you can start building better search capability. And obviously, searching for information, making decisions, whatever. That's the new monetization engine, right? That's what's made Google so powerful, to be able to give away all the software because they're charging for ads, and that's all based on search relevance and being the place where people come to find stuff that they want to do. So I think any search provider is probably trying to find more new channels that they can provide authoritative search on, and every one you add, makes you stronger.
I'd like to throw in one more thing briefly to this particular topic, rather than saying, just focusing on the fact of is this cloud computing, or are these legitimate? I want to look more at acquisitions in general. A lot of companies are jumping into this, and they're positioning themselves within cloud computing in their own way because, well, everyone wants to be a part of it, right? So, Damon, I specifically want to ask you, CA acquired AppLogic
3
last week, 3Terra, and their product AppLogic is the product last week. So, obviously they were a competitor to Morph Labs. And what do you think of that? I mean, what's your company's stance on that? And also, what does it say about the marketplace that you've got these players that are acquiring companies like yours?
I think I'll put it this way. I think it's a great deal for 3Terra. I mean, anytime that you have a big dog like CA come in and is willing to put kind of the capital and the resources and engineering, I mean, there's a level of service and support that they would not be able to have otherwise without CA. There's a lot of fear out there in terms of, they're going to change the product. I feel like if CA felt that there was enough kind of value in that company to invest in it, they're not going to mess with it too much. I think they're looking for ways that they can start getting into that business. I mean, in terms of acquisitions go, the business is in such a place right now that everybody realizes that the way that we develop and deploy and maintain software is changing.
Yep.
And that the way that it's going is going to be more cloud-like models. So anyone who makes it their business to develop, deploy, and maintain software in any way, shape, or form has to have some kind of a cloud play, some kind of solution, some kind of way to address that. Because that's where the future's going. That's what their customers are asking for. So CA, I mean, they are a massive, massive systems integrator, if nothing else. So if they weren't already developing some kind of thing, they want to have these elements because
so it's a build versus buy decision.
I think so. I mean, because they've made some other acquisitions in a similar space as well. So they're looking for ways that they can start putting together some kind of a solution that is comprehensive, that can address the needs of their client.
Okay.
So I think you're going to see more of these kind of big companies either dropping money to find the innovation or developing the solutions themselves. I think more of the innovation is happening outside, so that's why you're going to see more of these kind of acquisitions in that space. And at the end of the day, I think it's fine because, there's some fear about, they got acquired, so they may go away. I'm like, but suppose 3Terra ran out of money, they go away too.
Right.
So, I mean, it's, clearly, I think Morph is a vastly superior product, but that's a whole other, because 3Terra is a largely proprietary. I mean, they're one of the earlier players in this space before you had a lot of these open standards established.
How old are you two comparatively?
Right.
I mean,
just ballpark.
What, 3Terra?
Well, how old are you guys?
Oh, Morph Labs, we officially started bringing on our SaaS clients early 2008. But we had been in development for some time before we put that out there.
So you basically preceded the whole cloud madness. Is that true? Would that be fair to say?
I mean, because the cloud really got crazy, last year?
Yeah, it's been very recent.
So Morph had already been, like I said, we've got about 4,000 deployments on the public version of Morph right now. So we did that. I like to. I joke with Amanda that my boss Winston, he kind of lives about a year into the future, and he always kind of.
I was going to say you guys anticipated the future clearly because you'd formed the company working on a product which the market demand suddenly spiked for it. Maybe a year or two ago. No, certainly no more than that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're going to see, if I could toot our own home for a little bit, we're going to do some more future telling in a little bit too. But anyway,
and arguably the market hasn't spiked. Arguably the market hasn't spiked yet. I mean, it's coming up. So I think if you look at where application servers have gone, and interestingly enough, the CEO of Sonoa Systems, my company, Chet Kapoor, worked for Glue Code and sold Glue Code to IBM, which Damon had mentioned before. Yeah. So the application server market has changed in an interesting way, right? In sort of the early 2000s, there was BEA Systems and others providing Java application servers. Microsoft had the .NET. They didn't call it an app server, but that's what it was. And then those were proprietary and commercial, and then it got displaced by open source. And now people are like, well, if I can run these things on servers, then where's the value? Clearly, the value is in systems like Morph or 3Terra or Heroku, where now you just don't have to worry about what physical server it's running on. The hardest thing in app service was always doing clustering. Well, this basically gets taken care of you by these kinds of new application fabrics. So everybody who wants to be in that market now is going to need to pick up one of these companies. So I suspect that means Morph is in play, Engine Yard's in play, Heroku's in play, and that's a whole market within what we call cloud computing, which is really composed of many, many markets right now.
Yeah, okay. All right, moving right along. Issue number 3. We're only on issue 3. What's going on, people? The cloud and geopolitics. This is from The Wisdom of Clouds by James Urquhart. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. So
Urquhart?
Urquhart, perhaps. All right.
Urquhart.
So he argues that I should not use the voice while I'm explaining his article, so I won't. That basically, one of the things that's coming out of the cloud architecture, the fact that it's distributed, is that it crosses borders, right? So you have you have basically providers in multiple countries. What's missing from this, or what's sort of bumping heads with this, is the privacy laws in different countries. Basically real world border issues. I mean, it's really no different in a lot of ways than what we're seeing with the internet in large. You have China has completely different policies, Iran has different policies than clearly in the United States. But cloud providers are now just starting to provide what he calls explicit service boundaries to address these geopolitical realities. So, and he cites Amazon's EC2 regions as an example of this. Mm-hmm. Right, so I went and clicked on the link, and so far there was like basically the California region, there was Virginia, and then I think the UK. So I kind of looked at that and went, well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say the UK is that different. Well, I mean, I take that back. Actually, Europe has very different privacy sensibilities than the United States.
UK in particular has passed legislation very recently that is quite different from the United States. So that's UK is quite a good place to start.
I see. So that's actually a fairly major thing. Okay, I stand corrected.
Oh, for sure.
Okay. So
yeah, they pretend to share a language, but really there's not that much in common.
So I mean, basically the question. So what's happening to the cloud is it's starting to fracture, right? Along borders of geography, and basically the author wonders what would happen if the digital world applications started self-regulating, the cloud started self-restricting based on what region things are being served from or to, and what the political fallout of such a system would be. So
look, it already kind of does, right? If you bought a Google AdWord, right, you know that one of the fundamental things you do in that particular cloud service, that's an advertising cloud service, you indicate what regions you're going to show the advertisement in, right? So there's already some restriction there. And because of the USA Patriot Act, you start dealing with issues in other countries of national sovereignty, where once I could buy an application server, run it in my house, buy a database from Oracle, run it on my soil, and then worst case, if I wanted to, deal with search and seizure, I could just grab that box. What if that is being run by Google in the United States, right? Can I expatriate the data? Does the Patriot Act mean that the United States government has the ability to look at the data that's in servers that are physically hosted in their country? It's a bunch of really thorny, messy issues, and politically messier, I think, than anything that technology has come across before.
And what are these new laws we're passing in the UK? What do you know specifically about them?
Right.
There's data on UK citizens that's publicly collected cannot leave the boundaries of the United Kingdom's physical borders, I think is one of them. There are a number of other nuances.
Wow.
Right? So pretty fascinating. So that means even if you've got a cloud service that's based in the US, you collect that data, arguably that means that has to be written immediately to a local data store and data center on UK soil. So these legislations are going to work out for a while. They don't necessarily make sense. They aren't always implementable, but we're going to have to figure out as an industry, how do we have some standards here, and how do we say, here's what's feasible and here are the promises that we can make. Otherwise, this balkanization is going to be one of the real restrictions in the growth of cloud computing. And when I had the privilege to be in these discussions at Microsoft, this was one of the key issues that we had to deal with. Government saying, hey, we love what's going on with with Live and with some of the other services you offer, but how do we deal with Patriot Act?
Wow.
Did they ever say what was the rationale behind that law, the UK law, where they wanted to make sure that those...
Europe has a very different concept of privacy than the United States. I was just reading, I can't remember where I was reading this article, but basically they regard privacy as a fundamental human right, whereas the United States does not quite see it the same way. So I can't remember the opposing viewpoint, but it was more like it's sort of a privilege, I guess.
So the idea being that if your private data can't cross the border, therefore we can do what?
Your private
data.
That's
something like it's not clear to me what advantage it has other than it makes it easier for a government entity to manage, restrict, and control and enforce law enforcement on that over that data. If that's the idea, I don't know that if you assume that the government is ultimately the protector of your privacy,
right.
I suppose that's what that means. But it sounds more like a control play than a privacy play. I don't know.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, you think about the software industry. It's if you follow the dollars, it's primarily a U.S. based industry, and if you follow where the taxes get paid, right, it also ends up coming either to tax shelters or back to the U.S. So you don't want to take those kinds of dependencies again. And there's going to be a lot more game planning. You've seen at the global level what the European Commission has started to do in antitrust after they had their fun with Microsoft. They then did the same thing with Oracle with the Sun acquisition of MySQL. So there's a lot of things afoot politically right now. So you're going to see things that don't make sense, right? Remember how laws get written. People in powdered wigs interpreting statements written by experts and then passing a law that may bear little or no resemblance to the first document that was there, and now we all have to follow it. So it's not trivial.
Now, do you honestly believe that this UK law was passed more for economic reasons than actual, privacy reasons?
I have no idea why the UK passed that law. I don't have insight into their politics.
Okay, but you suspect maybe had something to do with it.
It could entirely be economic protectionism, right? It could be, if you look at the European Union, where they've invested in cloud computing to sort of bring this full circle back to the topic at hand. They've invested in something called NESSI, or NESSI, which is an organization of European governments and a few different software companies that's building an open source cloud infrastructure, which can then be built on premise or for each individual government within Europe to be able to run their own cloud. That's very much the opposite of relying on Google App Engine or Google Apps or Microsoft Azure. It's really saying, look, I'm going to take cloud computing as a matter of national security and technological nationalism, and I'm going to build my own. And if I don't have the money to build my own, I'm going to pool that via open source with 15 or 20 other governments. So that's what I see.
Okay. No, we should probably listen and see if I can hear something again. I think something.
Oh no, now he's flying.
This is like Apocalypse Now.
Storm on demand.
You have way too much fun with
Storm
this.
on demand. Well, it's just fun to say, So, all right. So Storm on demand is an infrastructure as a cloud. Sorry, Storm on demand is infrastructure as a service. Cloud computing platform that is powerful enough to replace dedicated servers. It's a proprietary cloud platform designed by Liquid Web, one of the largest web hosting providers with over 12 years of experience. Storm on demand is easier to use and less expensive than Amazon EC2. Features include server setup in minutes, easy scaling, backup and restoration capabilities, pay-as-you-go utility-style billing. Storm on demand options include cPanel, Fantastico, Ubuntu, Debian, CentOS, fully managed servers, private networking, and much, much more. Storm on Demand can be found at stormondemand.com. Again, our heartfelt thanks to Storm on Demand for coming in for not one, but 2 sponsor slots on This Week in Cloud Computing. So this is the first week we've had them. We're very delighted. As you can see, they sponsored our mugs. So we'll have better than just sort of taped on logos next time around, but we couldn't get the cups here in time, so we did the best we could. So Storm on Demand, thank you.
Should we jump into some news?
We should jump into some news, except you're going to have to give me a moment here while I find the news. So
Well, do we want to start with the first story?
Actually, I'm going to skip that story because I think there's some other stories that are better. But anyway, so this is a quote. This is kind of a lengthy quote, so I'm going to read it.
You and your
exactly.
quotes.
I know. Well, so Mark Benioff, Salesforce.com. Last week we argued. Well, we didn't argue. We had a polite discussion about whether Salesforce.com was the world's first $1 billion cloud computing company. Mark Benioff announced it, grandiosely that, hey, we're the world's top. We're the first ones to make it to $1 billion. So it was debatable, but we kind of gave it to him in the end, I think, grudgingly. So here's a quote from him, and he says, in this decade, so he described how in the last decade he was obsessed with a different question. In this decade, he's obsessed with a new question. Why isn't all enterprise software like Facebook? As we, being Salesforce.com, we're focused on bringing enterprise computing into the modern age, Facebook redefined the values of consumer computing, then helped ignite the social phenomenon. The compelling aspect of feeds, profiles, and groups amplify the service's stickiness. So does its functionality on a mobile device like an iPhone, necessary to secure a service's status as a killer app. Facebook is where I start my day to find out what my friends and family are doing. He basically just goes on to say, Facebook is my new center. So,
That was me pointing over at Eric.
Okay, I'm almost finished. So basically, he's now introduced something called Salesforce Chatter, which takes the best of Facebook and Twitter and other social leaders and applies it to enterprise collaboration. Question: and he basically thinks of Salesforce Chatter as his answer, his cloud-based answer to things like Twitter, Facebook, and Twitter, etc. Question: is he right? Does this have anything to do with the cloud, or he seems to think it does? He seems to think these ideas are tied together. Are they?
I'll put it this way. I mean, he's right. I mean, I do the same thing from a personal perspective. I go on the Facebook page. The next place that I look every day is LinkedIn. And I wish that LinkedIn had more of the flexibility that I see through Facebook and Twitter, even though it's still integrated and I have a LinkedIn app. So, but that's from a professional perspective. I suppose it depends on what the nature of what you do is. Whether you need to have, I'm in business development and sales. My part of my job is through networking and interacting with large amounts of people in various dispersed organizations.
Right.
Other people, their jobs are very, very, very specific and require engagements with very specific people, and so maybe not so much. So I don't know. I could see the value. I could see the value of that if I was using Salesforce already.
Well, that's just it. I mean,
Right.
so you have to first of all buy that Salesforce.com is a cloud computing, application as service. So it all depends.
Well,
on
I mean, it is, but it's
right?
CRM as a service. I mean, it's a very specific. It's
Yes, it
CRM
is.
as a service and application development
But
as
the
a
point
service.
is, before you used to have your own sales lead. Like I forget, like Goldmine or something like that.
Right.
And you'd have to remember that you have to install it on your LAN, inside of your office, and set up your Novell network or whatever. And that was basically how you did sales lead tracking and collaborating on sales lead tracking. And so when they introduced Salesforce.com, suddenly you had essentially the same thing, but in the cloud.
Right.
You logged into a website, etc. So now he's introducing this Chatter thing, which he views as being the next level of that cloud, service on the cloud.
But why would you use that if you weren't? Why would you use that instead of using Twitter?
Good
Well,
question.
I think we
Sam,
need to
what do
throw
you
this
think?
over to Sam,
Yeah.
because Sam, I believe
Sam's
you
being
probably
very
have a
polite,
lot to
so-
say with
sorry.
open APIs and stuff like that. So get in on the conversation.
I think this is a really interesting question to raise, because it raises the question: what is a cloud service? Right? Is Twitter a website, or is it a cloud service? And I think of a couple things as kind of Facebook. You can ask the same question. I look at a couple of different angles here. One is it the only place that you can get the majority of the market, right? Is that the only place that has all of the data? A little bit like Google for search, right? With Twitter or with Facebook, I'd say yeah. The other one is, can you access it from a machine and not just from a website, right? Does it have an API? Most of Twitter's adoption and traffic came through its APIs. It starts to look much more like a cloud service. Salesforce, if you look at those kinds of statistics, yeah, they've got most of the shared CRM data. And yeah, they drive probably 78% of their traffic through APIs rather than through their website. So, these claims about, is Salesforce sort of the billion-dollar cloud company? Yeah, probably so. Do they have critical mass in terms of having tens of thousands of customers? Yeah, probably so. Would somebody use Chatter instead of Twitter or Facebook? I find that really questionable. A lot of providers that are the dominant in their category think that they can now copy somebody else's best ideas, but they've overlooked the fact that the critical mass for cloud service is the people already using it. So it's very, very hard to replicate Google and Gmail. It's very hard to replicate Twitter. It's very hard to replicate Facebook. I'd argue that right now it's impossible. So I would think a smarter design for Chatter than what's there so far, and I've checked it out. My company is a Salesforce customer, and we're looking at using Hip Chatter, Yammer, or something else internally instead of Chatter. A smarter design would have been to incorporate these over-the-top services. Use Facebook. It's Facebook.
Exactly.
Right? Use Twitter. It is actually the Twitter. And find a way to, secure it, pass the messages in a particular way, just be a little bit smarter and find a way to be inclusive. Again, to kind of finish where I started the podcast, follow the Tim O'Reilly model of, small pieces loosely joined. And you're going to end up with a more exciting experience that's fun and doesn't have to, sort of replicate things that have already been built very effectively.
Okay.
Very good points.
Okay.
Another quick news story?
Yeah, let's move on to the next one. So at the RSA conference this week, Microsoft announced the wide availability of its UProve technology. It was announced by Scott Charney, the corporate vice president of Microsoft's Trustworthy Computing Group, ostensibly formed to address the trust issue of the cloud. And he explained how the company's visions for the end-to-end trust and as it applies to cloud computing. UProve is basically a claims-based identity meta system, and I have no idea what I just said. I read that about 50 times before I came in here. I'm still not quite clear on it. But the idea is that basically it provides, it's an identity solution, like that much I got, and it's made for cloud applications specifically or in part, and it's going to be included in C# development kits, et cetera, all of Microsoft's development products. Sam, do you have any insight on what this is? Is this something that you've run across?
Yeah, so Scott Charney, I know Scott. He's a good guy. Came out of doing government security for the U.S. government before he went to Microsoft. A lot of the work that Trustworthy Computing has done is creating trusted paths. How do you know that every single thing is secure all the way through the CPU and that everything worked properly? In terms of claims-based identity, this is super important for cloud applications. Going back to the Twitter and Facebook model, have you noticed how many applications now you can log into or create your account by linking it to Twitter or linking it to Facebook?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
How does that work? It works through a technology called OAuth, right? And through a concept of like I'm gonna ride along on that identity, and I'm just gonna give like a little token to this current service that I can revoke later. The idea of having a dozen services that have to work together is how do you prove what rights somebody has? So that's why you have this meta system, right? It crosses multiple systems. It's an identity. It's based on who you are, and claims. You're making a claim. I am Sam. I have the right to see this content on ESPN because I paid for all of the NFL capabilities, all of the NFL shows and all that data. And then there's another provider or more in the system that can verify my claims. They can say, "Yep, that's Sam," and another one can say, "Yep, that's the person that has these NFL rights." They can put those together in a way that doesn't require any single system in the entire network to have all of the answers, and they can all share their bits of data and then say, "Yep, we can proceed with this application as planned." And it's going to be absolutely crucial for cloud computing because many applications will have to work together, and you don't want to trust a single thing like VeriSign or RSA with 100% of your identity, 100% of all of this information. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Actually, the other thing that came to mind when I read this was, who remembers Microsoft Passport?
Oh, wow.
You know what I'm talking about. If you're old,
yeah.
you remember.
Hailstorm. You want to go even farther back.
Yeah. Well, Microsoft Passport was. Oh, sorry, we lost you, Sam, there for a second. Did you say?
He's back.
Yeah, I said Hailstorm to go even farther back.
I don't remember Hailstorm. What was that?
Hailstorm was the private beta that collapsed. That was the only thing that came out of it was Passport.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Microsoft Passport was a Microsoft product. I think it was about 10 to 15 years ago it came out. I think it might even be 15 years ago. And it was very much like today when you can log into all these disparate sites with your Twitter account or your Facebook account. Basically mostly Facebook Connect right now being the primary example. You can go to all these other sites and just using your Facebook username and password automatically log into a site you've never been to before. It's almost like you automatically have an account on all these sites on the internet.
Yeah, it was like OpenID, but before OpenID, and provided by a single provider as opposed to several, right? So that has all the issues of sort of that monopoly base of just one provider.
So Microsoft attempted to own this back in the day, and everyone, I think, and it failed. It basically was a failure. Nobody used it. And I think the reason why is because Microsoft did it, and everyone was afraid. I'm speculating. I don't really know. But, I mean, from my perspective, from what I saw, everyone was a little bit spooked out by the fact that, the quote-unquote evil empire at the time. Really, that perception has faded a lot, but back then it was very strong.
Yeah.
Well, it was also built wrong, right? It was built on Microsoft as being the only trust provider, which didn't make sense. So what they did was they went and hired a really well-respected identity architect named Kim Cameron. He has his own groupies that follow him around when he goes to security conferences. They're like, "Oh, Kim." I mean, he's a really well-regarded guy. And he built this identity meta system on the basis of the idea that nobody's going to trust one single provider. You got to have something that does everything. So that's been a lot of the work that Scott has done. And reading this announcement out as you did, it just sort of pops to me. Cloud Security Alliance, UProve, right? Microsoft is starting to get it and rely on dozens of providers as opposed to assuming that people are going to go the Passport route and just trust one company.
Yeah, no, it did definitely play differently than Passport or things we've seen in the past. So,
they learned from that failure.
So kudos to them for that. So, okay, any further thoughts on that?
Sales guy. No,
just a sales guy.
Really.
Okay.
I mean,
nothing to sell there.
No, more to the point. I mean, I agree that ultimately you're going to have multiple points of trust in order for these kind of things to work. I think there's, the minute you said, you prove, I immediately think like, the Healthy Skies Act. I mean, it sounds so much more kind of like the propaganda than actual underlying technology itself to me.
It's hard to tell with press releases, to be honest.
Well, that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. I mean, ultimately the proof is going to be in the pudding. I mean, we'd have to see what it actually is that they do and how does that work.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I can't really speculate beyond that.
So does UProve, does it actually, is it used for cloud-based applications to communicate with one another securely, or is it just for an individual interacting with a cloud offering? Do you know the answer to that, Sam?
Yeah, claims-based mechanisms aren't transport layer security. Wouldn't compete with SSL, right? But let's take an example of, there's 4,000 applications in Morph, as Damon has pointed out. If 10 of them ended up, the developers got together and said, hey, it'd be cool if some of our users could move around and there's some shared services, right? I'm a video provider.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. I'm a social media provider. Let's get together. It'd be a system that would let them not have to have multiple logins, multiple IDs, and sort of have one identity across all those systems, which would be cool, right? Because how many damn usernames and passwords do you want?
No, it's clearly beneficial. So, okay, let's move on. I guess we have time for one more story.
One more story.
We're a little over, but it's all right.
This is good stuff.
It is good stuff. I
content.
agree.
This is good fun. I can do this.
Okay, so remember that joke I made? I think it was 2 weeks ago about we're talking
You
about
make jokes?
I do sometimes. we had this. We were talking about the definition of cloud computing, and I was like, it's so ridiculous that I could say I have a desktop cloud right here. Look, this is a cloud on my desktop with a screen. And as I was reading the news this week, Intel went and made my joke a reality. This week at CeBIT they demoed a 48-core cloud computing chip. Yes, I did say that. So basically, it's a cloud in a chip. So there are 40. Wow. So basically, there's 48 cores. Let's see. Intel described the processor as a single-chip cloud computer, which is exactly what I said. Where all the cores are connected to one another using a mesh interconnect, which means each core runs its own operating system, or it can be used as part of a larger coordinated operating system.
So it looks like it's got a hypervisor built into the chip layer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just a demo right now, so it's not a reality. But the desktop cloud appears to be real. So
48 core.
Yeah, what do you think? What would you use that for? Well,
that
was my question. Is why would you want this? Why is this a good thing?
Oh, it's fantastic because you can provide a whole bunch of different environments. You've got much lower power consumption for being able to run a certain amount of code.
Oh, the
you think
power's
about
a very
running
big
your
thing,
own.
actually.
You think about running your own application server, right? You don't want to do that, right? You throw eucalyptus down on this, and you throw Morph down on top of that, and now you've got several different app environments, and it's gonna make computing a heck of a lot cheaper. So it's fairly amazing that they're going in this direction. Not surprising they call it a cloud. It's just marketing, right? I mean, we're going to have an 80-core chip in a couple of years. They might call that a high-performance computing cluster on a chip, if that seems like the way to sell into the biopharmaceutical industry, right? So they're a super sensitive and sensible marketing company. Does this directly relate to cloud computing? Only to the extent that you want to have elasticity, and now you've got elasticity on a single chip. I remember when 48 cores used to take up an entire rack in a data center. Right, and now it's going to be running at a power requirement that's going to promise that you won't kill your power bill and you're not going to melt anything around the CPU. So that's kind of awesome.
Well, so anyone and a lot of people who've never run or done their own data center probably don't know this, but basically the gig for the data centers is they will charge you for the space, but where they really get you is the power.
Yeah.
The power charges are what go through the roof. That and the cooling.
Sure.
I was about to say cooling is the next issue too.
So, which is of course related to heat, which is related to power. So,
right.
So these things are all a little intertwined. So,
well, that's the thing. I mean, as you start to consolidate these things even more,
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually an article that I just read that talks about how you're starting to run across the upper limit of what you can do in terms of cooling in these spaces. The more you start to condense these things into a smaller and smaller space. And there's all kinds of crazy solutions out there now, like people running liquid over the chips to try and keep them cool. I mean, it becomes much more of an ensigneering problem at that point too.
Yeah, but
the missing part of the story that should be in there is why did they make this announcement? I suspect that NVIDIA and the progress they're making is kind of popping up here. I don't know if you're familiar with them as a graphics card provider, but it turns out that there's this idea of a general purpose graphics processing unit, or a GPGPU. You can run a lot of the computations you have to do for much, much less power and much less cooling required, because that's kind of a double whammy. More power you have to put in, the hotter the chip is, the more you have to pay for cooling. It's sort of a vicious cycle. So there's some real potential shifts there around who's going to be the hardware and the silicon provider to the future cloud. That'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Interesting. Okay.
Wow, that's a good discussion today, guys. Thank you so much. I think we're going to start wrapping things up because, well, we've gone to about an hour and 15 minutes, but that's because we have good content.
Yeah.
So, let's definitely say thank you to Mark Jeffrey, my co-host. I would like to say thank you to Sam Ramji, VP of Strategy at Sonoa Systems, correct?
Thank you very much, yes.
And also Damon Young, VP of Sales at Morph Labs.
You guys have some URLs we can throw out?
So, yeah, where would you like people to find more information?
I'd love for people to come to Apogee, which is our cloud service. It's www.apigee.com, like APIs, G. That's a free service that allows you to manage, monitor, and rate limit any of the APIs you either provide or consume. And if you want more information about the technology that powers that, it's www.sonoa, S-O-N-O-A, systems, systems.com.
Excellent.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then Damon, same with you?
Yeah, the main site that I would send people to is our newly launched website for Morph Labs, which would be www.mor.ph, where you can look at information on both of our cloud server offering, which is essentially our cloud in a box, as well as our cloud controller, where you can actually deploy our technology if you have your existing hardware assets that you want to create into a cloud inventory. And they can also, if you go to the contact form, you can request one of our starter kits. We'll ship a little tiny box that has our technology on it and has about 10 VMs just to do as a proof of concept as well too.
Great.
So yeah, those would be the ones.
Excellent. And of course, you can follow these guys day for night on Twitter, and then Sam is S Ramji on Twitter. So on that note, I would also like to thank our sponsors.
Absolutely.
So if you would, everyone, please send a thank you out to our sponsors for today's show, Verticore, at Verticore, and also Storm on Demand.
Demand. We need an effect for that next time. I'll do something about that.
So yes, many thanks to our sponsors because they make the show possible. So on that note, I'm Amanda Coulong, your host of This Week in Cloud Computing. Join us next week when we have a big security show. So see you then. Thanks, everybody.